Hi everyone, I'm Nalani Brown, the philanthropy coordinator from Frank Toby Jones, and I'm coming at you with a short story by Agatha Christie in her book, The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding, and this is called The Underdog. Lily McGrave smoothed her gloves out on her knee with a nervous gesture and darted a glance at the occupant of the big chair opposite her. She had heard of M. Hercule Poirot, a well-known investigator, but this was the first time she had seen him in the flesh. The cosmic, almost ridiculous aspect that he presented disturbed her conception of him. Could this funny little man with his egg-shaped head and the enormous mustaches really do the wonderful things that were claimed for him? His occupation, at the moment, struck her as particularly childish. He was piling small blocks of colored wood, one upon the other, and seemed far more interested in the result than in the story she was telling. At her sudden silence, however, he looked sharply across at her. "Mademoiselle, continue, I pray of you. It is not that I do not attend. I attend very carefully, I assure you." He began once more to pile little blocks of wood, one upon the other, while the girl's voice took up the tale again. It was a gruesome tale, a tale of violence and tragedy, but the voice was so calm and unemotional. The recital was so concise that something of the savor of humanity seemed to have been left out of it. She stopped at last. "I hope," she said anxiously, "that I've made everything clear." Poirot nodded his head several times in emphatic assent. He swept his hand across the wooden blocks, scattering them over the table, and leaning back in his chair. His fingertips pressed together, and his eyes on the ceiling, he began to recapitulate. Poirot nodded his head several times in emphatic assent. Then he swept his hand across the wooden blocks, scattering them over the table, and leaning back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together and his eyes on the ceiling, he began to recapitulate. Sir Reuben Astwell was murdered 10 days ago, on Wednesday, the day before yesterday. His nephew Charles Leverson was arrested by the police. The facts against him, as far as you know, are, you will correct me if I'm wrong, Mademoiselle, Sir Reuben was sitting up late, writing in his own special sanctum, the tower room. Mr. Leverson came in late, letting himself in with a latchkey. He was overheard quarreling with his uncle by the butler, whose room is directly below the tower room. The quarrel ended with a sudden thud, as of a chair being thrown over, and a half-smothered cry. The butler was alarmed and thought of getting up to see what was the matter, but as a few seconds later he heard Mr. Leverson leave the room gaily whistling a tune, he thought nothing more of it. On the following morning, however, a housemaid discovered Sir Reuben dead by his desk. He had been struck down by some heavy instrument. The butler, I gather, did not at once tell his story to the police. That was natural, I think, eh, Mademoiselle? The sudden question made Lily McGrave start. "I beg your pardon," she said. One looks for humanity in these matters, does one not?" said the little man. "As you recited the story to me so admirably, so concisely, you made of the actors in the drama machines, puppets. But me, I look always for human nature. I say to myself, this butler, what did you say his name was?" "His name is Parsons." "This Parsons, then, he will have the characteristics of his class. He will object very strongly to the police. He will tell them as little as possible. Above all, he will say nothing that might seem to incriminate a member of the household. A housebreaker, a burglar, he will cling to that idea with the strength of extreme obstinacy. Yes, the loyalties of the servant class are an interesting study." He leaned back, beaming. "In the meantime," he went on, "everyone in the household has told his or her tale, Mr. Leverson among the rest, and his tale was that he had come in late and gone up to bed without seeing his uncle. That is what he said, and no one saw reason to doubt that tale, mused Poirot, except, of course, Parsons. Then there comes down an inspector from Scotland Yard. Inspector Miller, you said. Did you know? I knew him. I have come across him once or twice in the past. He is what they call the sharp man, the ferret, the weasel. Yes, I know him. And the sharp Inspector Miller, he sees what the local inspector has not seen, that Parsons is ill at ease and uncomfortable, and knows something that he has not told. Ah, bien. He makes short work of Parsons. By now it has been clearly proved that no one broke into the house that night, that the murderer must be looked for inside the house and not outside. And Parsons is unhappy and frightened, and feels very relieved to have his secret knowledge drawn out of him. He has done his best to avoid scandal, but there are limits, and so Inspector Miller listens to Parsons' story and asks a question or two, and then makes some private investigations of his own. The case he builds up is very strong. It's a very strong one. Blood-stained fingers rested on the corner of the chest in the tower room, and the fingerprints were those of Charles Leverson. The housemaid told him she emptied a basin of blood-stained water in Mr. Leverson's room the morning after the crime. He explained to her that he had cut his finger, and he had a little cut there. Oh yes, but such a very little cut. The cut of his evening shirt had been washed, but they found bloodstains in the sleeve of his coat. He was hard-pressed for money, and he inherited money at Sir Reuben's death. Oh yes, a very strong case, mademoiselle. He paused. And yet you come to me today. Lily McGrave shuddered her slender shoulders. As I told you, M. Poirot, Lady Astwell sent me. You would not come on your own accord, eh? The little man glanced at her shrewdly. The girl did not answer. You do not reply to my question. Lily McGrave began smoothing her gloves again. It is rather difficult for me, M. Poirot. I have my loyalty to Lady Astwell to consider. Strictly speaking, I am only her paid companion, but she has treated me more as though I were a daughter or a niece. She has been extraordinarily kind, and whatever her faults, I should not like to appear to criticize her actions or, well, to prejudice you against taking up the case. Impossible to prejudice Hercule Poirot. C'est laissez faire, passe, declared the little man cheerily. I perceive that you think Lady Astwell has in her bonnet the buzzing bee. Come now, is it not so? If I must say, speak, mademoiselle, please. I think the whole thing is simply silly. It strikes you like that, eh? I don't want to say anything against Lady Astwell. I comprehend, murmured Poirot gently. I comprehend perfectly. His eyes invited her to go on. She really is a very good sport, and frightfully kind, but she isn't, how can I put it? She isn't an educated woman. You know, she was an actress when Sir Reuben married her, and she has all sorts of prejudices and superstitions. If she says a thing, it must be so, and she simply won't listen to reason. The inspector was not very tactful with her, and it put her back up. She says it is nonsense to suspect Mr. Leverson, and just the sort of stupid pig-headed mistake the police would make. And that, of course, dear Charles did not do it. But she has no reasons, eh? None whatsoever. Ha, is that so? Really now. I told her, said Lily, that it would be no good coming to you with a mere statement like that and nothing to go on. You told her that, said Poirot. Did you really? That's interesting. His eyes swept over Lily McGrave in a quick, comprehensive survey, taking in the details of her neat black suit, the touch of white at her throat, and the small little black hat. She had the elegance of her. He saw the elegance of her, the pretty face with its slightly pointed chin, the dark blue, long-lashed eyes. Insensibly his attitude changed. He was interested now, not so much in the case as in the girl sitting opposite of him. Lady Astwell is, I should imagine, mademoiselle, just a trifle inclined to be unbalanced and hysterical. Lily McGrave nodded eagerly. That describes her exactly. She is, I told you, very kind, but it is impossible to argue with her or to make her see things logically. Possibly she suspects someone on her own account, suggested Poirot. Someone quite absurd. That is exactly what she does do, cried Lily. She has taken a great dislike to Sir Reuben's secretary. Poor man. She says she knows he did it. And yet it had been proved quite conclusively that poor Owen Trephissis cannot possibly have done it. And she has no reasons. Of course not. It's all intuition with her. Lily McGrave's voice was very scornful. I perceive, mademoiselle, said Poirot, smiling, that you do not believe in intuition. I think it's nonsense, replied Lily. Poirot leaned back in his chair. Les femmes, he murmured. They like to think that it is a special weapon that the good God has given them, and for every once that it shows them the truth, at least 9 times it leads them astray. I know, said Lily, but I have told you that Lady Astwell is like. I've told you what Lady Astwell is like. You simply cannot argue with her. So you, mademoiselle, being wise and discreet, came along to me as you were bidden, and have managed to put me au courant of the situation. Something in the tone of his voice made the girl look up sharply. Of course, I know, said Lily apologetically. How very valuable your time is. You are too flattering, mademoiselle, said Poirot. But indeed, yes, it is true, and at this present time I have many cases of moment on hand. I was afraid that might be so, said Lily, rising. I will tell Lady Astwell, but Poirot did not rise also. Instead, he lay back in his chair and looked steadily up at the girl. You are in haste to be gone, mademoiselle. Sit down one more little moment, I pray for you. He saw the color flood into her face and ebb out again. She sat down once more, slowly and unwillingly. Mademoiselle is quick and decisive, said Poirot. She must make allowances for an old man like myself, who comes into his decisions slowly. You mistook me, mademoiselle. I did not say that I would not go down to Lady Astwell. So you will come then? The girl's tone was flat. She did not look at Poirot, but down at the ground. She was so unaware of the keen scrutiny with which he regarded her. Tell Lady Astwell, mademoiselle, that I am entirely at her service. I will be at Mon Repos, is it not? This afternoon. He rose, and the girl followed suit. I will tell her it's very good of you to come, and Poirot. I am afraid, though, you will find you have been brought on a wild goose chase. Very likely, but who knows? He saw her out with punctilious courtesy at the door. Then he returned to the sitting room, frowning, deep in thought. Once or twice he nodded his head. Then he opened the door and called to his valet. My good George, prepare me, I pray of you, a little valise. I go down to the country this afternoon. Very good, sir, said George. He was an extremely English-looking person, tall, cadaverous, and unemotional. A young girl is a very interesting phenomenon, George, said Poirot as he dropped once more into his armchair and lighted a tiny cigarette. Especially, you understand, when she has brains. To ask someone to do a thing and at the same time to put them against doing it, that is a delicate operation. It requires finesse. She was very adroit. Oh, very adroit. But Hercule Poirot, my good George, is of a cleverness quite exceptional. I have heard you say so, sir. It is not the secretary she has in mind, mused Poirot. Lady Astwell's accusation of him she treats with contempt. Just the same, she is anxious that no one should disturb the sleeping dogs. My good George, I do go to disturb them. I go to make the dog fight. There's a drama there at Mon Repos, a human drama, and it excites me. She was adroit, the little one, but not adroit enough. I wonder what I shall find there. Into the dramatic pause which succeeded these words, George's voice broke apologetically. Shall I pack dress clothes, sir? Poirot looked at him sadly. Always the concentration, the attention of your own job. You are very good for me, George. When the 4.55 drew up at the Abbott's Cross station. Oh, When the 455 drew up at the Abbott's Cross station, there descended from it M. Hercule Poirot, very neatly and foppishly attired, his mustaches waxed to a stiff point. He gave up his jacket, passed through the barrier, and was accosted by a tall chauffeur. M. Poirot? The little man beamed upon him. That's my name. This way, sir, if you please. He held open the door of the big Rolls-Royce. The house was a bare 3 minutes from the station. The chauffeur descended once more and opened the door of the car, and Poirot stepped out. The butler was already holding the front door open. Poirot gave the outside of the house a swift appraising glance before passing through the open door. It was a big, solidly built, red brick mansion, with no pretensions to beauty, but with an air of solid comfort. Poirot stepped into the hall. The butler relieved him deftly of his hat and overcoat, then murmured with that deferential undertone only to be achieved by the best servants. Her ladyship is expecting you, sir. Poirot followed the butler up the soft carpeted stairs. This, without a doubt, was Parsons, a very well-trained servant with a manner suitably devoid of emotion. At the top of the staircase, he turned to the right along a corridor. He passed through a door into a little anteroom, from which 2 more doors led. He threw open the left hand one of these and announced, M. Poirot, m'lady. The room was not a very large one, and it was crowded with furniture and knickknacks. A woman, dressed in black, got up from a sofa and came quickly towards Poirot. M. Poirot, she said with an outstretched hand. Her eye ran rapidly over the dandified figure. She paused a minute, ignoring the little man's bow over her head and his murmur, Madam, and then released his hand after a sudden vigorous pressure. She exclaimed, I believe in small men. They are clever ones. Inspector Miller, murmured Poirot, is, I think, a tall man? He's a bumptious idiot, said Lady Astwell. Sit down here by me, will you, M. Poirot? She indicated the sofa and went on. Lily did her best to put me off sending for you, and I have not come to my time of life without knowing my own mind. A rare accomplishment, said Poirot, as he followed her to the settee. Lady Astwell settled herself comfortably among the cushions and turned so as to face him. Oh, Lily is a dear girl, said Lady Astwell, but she thinks she knows everything, and as often as not in my experience, those sort of people are wrong. I'm not clever, M. Poirot. I've never been, but I am right where many a more stupid person is wrong. I believe in guidance. Now, do you want me to tell you who is the murderer, or do you not? A woman knows, M. Poirot. Does Miss McGrave know? And what did she tell you? Asked Lady Astwell sharply. She gave me the facts of the case. The facts? Oh, of course, they are dead against Charles. But I tell you, M. Poirot, he didn't do it. I know he didn't. She bent upon him an earnestness that was almost disconcerting. You are very positive, Lady Astwell. Trefusis killed my husband, M. Poirot. I'm sure of it. Why? Why should he kill him, or do you mean why am I sure? I tell you I know it. I am funny about those things. I make up my mind at once and I stick to it. Did Mr. Trefusis benefit in any way by Sir Reuben's death? Never left him a penny, returned Lady Astwell promptly. Now that shows you dear Reuben couldn't have liked or trusted him. Had he been with Sir Reuben long then? Close on 9 years. Ooh, that is a long time, said Poirot softly. A very long time to remain in the employment of one man. Yes, Mr. Trefusis. He must have known his employer well. Lady Astwell stared at him. What are you driving at? I don't see what that has to do with it. I was following out a little idea of my own, said Poirot. A little idea, not interesting perhaps, but original, on the effects of service. Lady Astwell still stared. You are clever, aren't you? She said in a rather doubtful tone. Everybody says so. Hercule Poirot laughed. Perhaps you shall pay me that compliment too, madam, one of these days, but let us return to the motive. Tell me now of your household, of the people who were here in the house on the day of the tragedy. Well, there was Charles, of course. He was your husband's nephew, I understand, and not yours. Yes, Charles was the only son of Reuben's sister. She married a comparatively rich man, but one of those crashes came. They do, in the city, and he died, and his wife too. And Charles came to live with us. He was 23 at the time and going to be a barrister. But when the trouble came, Reuben took him into his office. He was industrious, Mr. M. Charles? I like a man who is quick on the uptake, said Lady Aswell with a nod of approval. No, that's just the trouble. Charles was not industrious. He was always having rows with his uncle over some muddle over what he had made. Not that poor Reuben was an easy man to get on with. Many's the time I've told him he'd forgotten what it was to be young himself. He was very different in those days, M. Poirot. Lady Aswell heaved a sigh of reminiscence. Changes must come, madam, said Poirot. It's the law. Still, said Lady Aswell, he was never really rude to me. At least if he was always sorry afterwards. Poor dear Reuben. So he was difficult, eh? Said Poirot. I could always imagine him, said Lady Aswell, with the air of successful lion tamer. But it was rather awkward sometimes when he would lose his temper with the servants. There are ways of doing that, and Reuben's was not the right way. And how exactly did Sir Reuben leave his money, Lady Aswell? Half to me, half to Charles, replied Lady Aswell promptly. The lawyers don't put it simply like that, but that's what it amounts to. Poirot nodded his head. I see, he murmured. Now, Lady Aswell, I will demand of you that you will describe to me the household. There was yourself, Sir Reuben's nephew, Mr. Charles Leverson, and the secretary, Mr. Owen Trefusis. And there was this Lily Magrave. Perhaps you will tell me something of that young lady? Oh, you want to know about Lily? Yes. Had she been with you long? About a year. I've had a lot of secretary companions, but somehow or another, they all got on my nerves. Lily's different. She was tactful and full of common sense, and besides, she looks so nice. I do like to have a pretty face about me, M. Poirot. I'm a funny kind of person. I take likes and dislikes straight away. As soon as I saw that girl, I said to myself, she'll do. Did she come to you through friends, Lady Aswell? I think she answered an advertisement. Yes, that was it. You know something of her people, where she comes from. Her father and mother are out in India, I believe. I don't really know much about them, but you can see at a glance that Lily is a lady, can't you, M. Poirot? Oh, perfectly. Of course, went on Lady Aswell, I am not a lady myself. I know it, and the servants know it, but there is nothing mean-spirited about me. I can appreciate the real thing when I see it, and no one could be nicer than Lily has been to me. I look upon that girl almost as a daughter, M. Poirot. Indeed I do. Poirot's right hand strayed out and straightened two of the objects lying on the table near him. Did Sir Reuben share this feeling? He asked. His eyes were on the knickknacks, but doubtless he noted the pause before Lady Aswell's answer came. With a man, it's different, of course. They got on very well. Thank you, madame, said Poirot. He was smiling to himself. And these were the only people in the house that night, he asked, excepting, of course, the servants. Oh, there was Victor. Victor? Yes, my husband's brother, and his partner. He lived with you? No, he had just arrived on a visit. He had been out in West Africa for the past few years. West Africa, murmured Poirot. He had learned that Lady Aswell could be trusted to develop a subject herself if sufficient time was given her. They say it's a wonderful country, but I think it's the kind of place that has a very bad effect upon a man. They drink too much, and they get uncontrolled. None of the Aswells had a good temper, and Victor, since he came back from Africa, has been simply too shocking. He's frightened me once or twice. Did he frighten Miss Magrave, I wonder? Murmured Poirot gently. Lily? Oh, I don't think he's seen much of Lily. Poirot made a note or two in the diminutive notebook. Then he put the pencil back in its loop and returned the notebook to its pocket. Thank you, Lady Aswell. I will now, if I may, interview Parsons. Will you have him up here? Lady Aswell's hand moved toward the bell. Poirot arrested the gesture quickly. No, 1,000 times no. I will descend to him. If you think it's better. Lady Aswell was clearly disappointed at not being able to participate in the forthcoming scene. Poirot adopted an air of secrecy. "It is essential," he said mysteriously, and left Lady Aswell duly impressed. He found Parsons in the butler's pantry, polishing silver. Poirot opened the proceedings with one of his funny little bows. "I must explain myself," he said. "I'm a detective agent." "Yes, sir," said Parsons. "We gathered as much." His tone was respectful but aloof. "Lady Aswell sent for me," continued Poirot. "She is not satisfied. No, she's not satisfied at all." "I have heard her ladyship say on several occasions," said Parsons. "In fact," said Poirot, "I recount to you the things you already know. Eh? Let us not waste time on these inconsistencies. Take me, if you will be so good, to your bedroom and tell me exactly what it was that you heard there on the night of the murder." The butler's room was on the ground floor, adjoining the servants' hall. It had barred windows, and the strong room was in one corner of it. Parsons indicated the narrow bed. "I had retired, sir, at about 11 o'clock. Miss McGrave had gone to bed, and Lady Aswell was with Sir Reuben in the tower room." "Lady Aswell was with Sir Reuben?" Proceed." "The tower room, sir, is directly over this. If people are talking in it, one can hear the murmur of voices, but naturally not anything that is said. I must have fallen asleep about 11:30, and it was just 12 o'clock when I was awakened by the sound of the front door being slammed, and I knew that Mr. Leverson had returned. Presently, I heard footsteps overhead, and a minute or two later, Mr. Leverson's voice talking to Sir Reuben. It was my fancy at the time that Mr. Leverson was, I should not exactly like to say drunk, but inclined to be a little indiscreet and noisy. He was shouting at his uncle at the top of his voice. I caught a word or two here or there, but not enough to understand what it was all about, and then there was a sharp cry and a heavy thud. Uh-oh. There was a pause, and Parsons repeated the last words. "A heavy thud," he said impressively. "If I mistake not, it is a dull thud in most works of romance," murmured Poirot. "Maybe, sir," said Parsons severely. "It was a heavy thud, I heard." "1,000 pardons," said Poirot. "Oh, do not mention it, sir. After the thud, in the silence, I heard Mr. Leverson's voice as plain as can be, raised high. 'Oh, my God,' he said. 'My God.' Just like that, sir." Parsons, from his first reluctance to tell the tale, had now progressed to a thorough enjoyment of it. He fancied himself mightily as a narrator. Poirot played up to him. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "what emotion you must have experienced." "Oh, yes, indeed, sir," said Parsons. "As you say, sir, not that I thought very much of it at the time, but it did occur to me to wonder if anything was amiss, and whether I had better go up and see. I went to turn the electric light on, and was unfortunate enough to knock over a chair. I opened the door and went through the servants' hall, and I opened the door which gives on a passage. The back stairs led up from there, and I stood at the bottom of them, hesitating. I heard Mr. Leverson's voice from up above, speaking hearty and cheery-like. 'No harm done, luckily,' he says. 'Good night.' And I heard him move off along the passage to his own room, whistling. Of course, I went back to bed as once, just something knocked over. That's all I thought it was. I ask you, sir, was I to think that Sir Reuben was murdered with Mr. Leverson saying good night and all?" "You are sure it was Mr. Leverson's voice you heard?" Parsons looked at the little Belgian pityingly, and Poirot saw clearly enough that, right or wrong, Parsons' mind was made up at this point. "Is there anything further you would like to ask me, sir?" "There's one thing," said Poirot. "Do you like Mr. Leverson?" I beg your pardon, sir?" "It is a simple question. Do you like Mr. Leverson?" Parsons, from being startled at first, now seemed embarrassed. "The general opinion in the servants' hall, sir," he said, and paused. "By all means," said Poirot. "Put it that way if it pleases you." "Okay. The opinion is that..." "The opinion is, sir, that Mr. Leverson is an open-handed young gentleman, but not, if I may say so, particularly intelligent, sir." "Ah," said Poirot, Do you know, Parsons, that without having seen him, it is also precisely my opinion of Mr. Leverson? Indeed, sir. What is your opinion, I beg your pardon? The opinion of the servants' hall of the secretary. He is a very quiet, patient gentleman, sir, anxious to give no trouble. Flamint, said Poirot. The butler coughed. Her ladyship, sir, he murmured, is apt to be a little hasty in her judgments. Then, in the opinion of the servants' hall, Mr. Leverson committed the crime? We none of us wish to think that it was Mr. Leverson, said Parsons. Plainly, we didn't think he had it in him, sir. But he has a somewhat violent temper, has he not? Asked Poirot. Parsons came nearer to him. If you are asking me who had the most violent temper in the house? Poirot held up a hand. But that is not the question I should ask, he said. My question would be, who has the best temper? Parsons stared at him open-mouthed. Poirot wasted no further time on him. With an amiable little bow, he was always amiable, he left the room and wandered out into the big square hall of Mon Repos. There he stood a minute or two in thought, then, at a slight sound that came to him, cocked his head to one side in the manner of a perky robin, and finally, with noiseless steps, crossed to the doors that led out the hall. He stood in the doorway, and looking into the room, a small room furnished as a library. At a big desk at the farther end of it sat a thin, pale young man busily writing. He had a receding chin and wore a pince-nez. Poirot watched him for some minutes, and then he broke the silence by giving a completely artificial and theatrical cough. Coughed Hercule Poirot. The young man at the desk stopped writing and turned his head. He did not appear unduly startled, but an expression of perplexity gathered on his face as he eyed Poirot. The latter came forward with a little bow. I have the honor of speaking to M. Trefusis, yes? My name is Poirot, Hercule Poirot. You may perhaps have heard of me. Yes, certainly, said the young man. Poirot eyed him attentively. Owen Trefusis was about 33 years of age, and the detective saw at once why nobody was inclined to treat Lady Aswell's accusation seriously. Mr. Owen Trefusis was a prim, proper young man, disarmingly meek, the type of man who can be, and is, systematically bullied. One could feel quite sure that he would never display resentment. Lady Aswell sent for you, of course, said the secretary. She mentioned that she was going to do so. Is there any way in which I can help you? His manner was quite polite, without being effusive. Poirot accepted a chair and murmured gently, Has Lady Aswell said anything to you of her beliefs and suspicions? Owen Trefusis smiled a little. As far as that goes, he said, I believe she suspects me. It is absurd, but there it is. She has hardly spoken a civil word to me since Sir Reuben's death, and she thinks against the wall as I pass by. His manner was perfectly natural, and there was more amusement than resentment in his voice. Poirot nodded with an air of engaging frankness. Between ourselves, he explained, she said the same thing to me. I did not argue with her. Me, I've made it a rule to never argue with very positive ladies. You comprehend, it's a waste of time. Oh, quite. I say, madame, oh, perfectly, madame. They mean nothing, those words, but they soothe all the same. I make my investigations, for though it seems almost impossible that anyone except M. Leverson could have committed the crime, yet, well, the impossible has happened before now. I understand your position perfectly, said the secretary. Please regard me as entirely at your service. Bon, said Poirot. We understand one another. Now recount to me the events of that evening. Better start with dinner. Okay, Leverson was at dinner. Leverson was not at dinner, as you doubtless know, said the secretary. He had a serious disagreement with his uncle and went off to dine at the golf club. Sir Reuben was in a very bad temper and conscience. Not too amiable, say, monsieur? Pointed Poirot delicately. Trefusis laughed. Oh, he was a tartar. I haven't worked with him for 9 years without knowing most of his little ways. He was an extraordinarily difficult man, and Poirot. He would get into childish fits of rage and abuse anybody who came near him. I was used to it by that time. I got into the habit of paying absolutely no attention to anything he said. He was not bad-hearted, really, but he could be most foolish and exasperating in his manner. The great thing was never to answer him back. Were other people as wise as you in that respect? Trefusis shrugged his shoulders. Lady Aswell enjoyed a good row, he said. She was not in the least afraid of Sir Reuben, and she always stood up to him and gave him as good as she got. They always made up afterwards, and Sir Reuben was really devoted to her. So did they quarrel that night? The secretary looked at him sideways and hesitated a minute. Then he said, I believe so, but what makes you ask? An idea, that's all. I don't know, of course, explained the secretary, but things looked as though they were working up that way. Poirot did not pursue the topic. Who else was at dinner? Miss McGrave, Mr. Victor Aswell, and myself. And afterwards, we went into the drawing room. Sir Reuben did not accompany us. About 10 minutes later, he came in and hauled me over to the coals for some trifling matter about a letter. I went up with him to the tower room and set the thing straight. Then Mr. Victor Aswell came in and said he had something he wished to talk about to his brother about. So I went downstairs and joined the two ladies. About a quarter of an hour later, I heard Mr. Reuben's bell ringing violently, and Parsons came to say I was to go up to Sir Reuben at once. As I entered the room, Mr. Victor Aswell was coming out. He nearly knocked me over. Something had evidently happened to upset him. He has a very violent temper. I really believe he didn't see me. Did Sir Reuben make any comment on the matter? He said, Victor is a lunatic. He will do for somebody someday when he is in one of those rages. Ah, said Poirot. Have you any idea what the trouble was about? I couldn't say at all. Poirot turned his heavy head slowly and looked at the secretary. Those last words had been uttered too hastily. He formed the conviction that Trefusis could have said more he had wished to do so. But once again, Poirot did not press the question. And then, proceed, I pray of you. I worked with Sir Reuben for about an hour and a half. At 11 o'clock, Lady Aswell came in, and Sir Reuben told me I could go to bed. And you went? Yes. Have you any idea how long she stayed with him? None at all. Her room is on the first floor and mine is on the second, so I would not hear her go to bed. I see. Poirot nodded his head once or twice and sprang to his feet. And now, monsieur, take me to the tower room. He followed the secretary up the broad stairs to the first landing. Here Trefusis led him along the corridor and through a baize door at the end of it, which gave on the servants' staircase and on a short passage that ended in a door. They passed through this door and found themselves on the scene of the crime. All right, we are going to stop there on The Underdog by Agatha Christie from her book, The Adventures of the Christmas Pudding. Again, I'm Nalani Brown, the philanthropy coordinator from Frank Toby Jones. Thanks for listening, and we will pick up on page 143.